Section 18 of A Daughter of the Sioux. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. A Daughter of the Sioux by General Charles King. Chapter 18. Burglary at Blake's. The doctor started at the heels of the corporal, but was distanced long before he reached the scene. The sergeant of the guard was hammering on the front door of Blake's quarters, but before the summons was answered from within, Mrs. Ray, in long, loose wrapper, came hurrying forth from her own, the adjoining hallway. Her face was white with dread. "It is I, Nanny. Let us in," she cried, and the door was opened by a terrified servant, as the doctor came panting up the steps. Together he and Mrs. Ray hurried in. "Robbers!" gasped the servant girl. "Gone the back way!" and collapsed on the stairs. Sergeant and corporal both tore around to the west side and out of the rear gate. Not a sign of fugitives could they see, and what was worse, not a sign of sentry. Number 5 of the 3rd Relief should at that moment have been pacing the edge of the bluff in rear of the northernmost quarters, and yet might be around toward the flagstaff. "Find Number 5 were the sergeant's orders, and back he hurried to the house, not knowing what to expect. By that time others of the guard had got there, and the officer of the day was coming. The clink of his sword could be heard down the road, and more windows were uplifted and more voices were begging for information, and then came Mrs. Dade, breathless but calm. Within doors she found the doctor ministering to a stout female who seemed to have gone off in an improvised swoon, Mrs. Blake's imported cook. Up the stairs to her own room again, Mrs. Blake was being led by Marian Ray's encircling arm. 3 women were speedily closeted there, for Mrs. Dade was like an elder sister to these 2 sworn friends, and not until Mrs. Dade and they were ready did that lady descend the stairs and communicate the facts to the excited gathering in the parlor, and they in turn to those on the porch in front. By this time Flint himself, with the poet quartermaster, was on hand, and all Fort Frayne seemed to rouse, and Mrs. Gregg had come with Mrs. Wilkins, and these 2 had relieved the doctor of the care of the cook, now talking volubly. And partly through her revelations, but mainly through the more coherent statements of Mrs. Dade, were the facts made public. Margaret, the cook, had a room to herself on the ground floor adjoining her kitchen. Belle, the maid, had been given the 2nd floor back in order to be near to her young mistress. Bitzer, the Blakes' man-of-all-work, like McGann, a discharged soldier, slept in the basement at the back of the house, and there was he found, blinking, bewildered, and only with difficulty aroused from stupor by a wrathful sergeant. The cook's story, in brief, was that she was awakened by Mrs. Blake's voice at her door, and thinking Belle was sick, she jumped up and found Mrs. Blake in her wrapper, asking was she, Margaret, upstairs a moment before. Then Mrs. Blake, with her candle, went into the dining room, and out jumped a man in his stocking feet from the captain's den across the hall, and knocked over Mrs. Blake and the light, and made for her, the cook, whereat she screamed and slammed her door in his face, and that was really all she knew about it. But Mrs. Blake knew more. Awakened by some strange consciousness of stealthy movement about the house, she called Belle by name, thinking possibly the girl might be ill and seeking medicine. There was sound of more movement, but no reply. Mrs. Blake's girlhood had been spent on the frontier. She was a stranger to fear. She arose, struck a light, and seeing no one in her room or the guest chamber and hallway, hastened to the 3rd room, and was surprised to find Belle apparently quietly sleeping. Then she decided to look about the house, and first went down and roused the cook. As she was coming out of the dining room, a man leapt past her in the hall, hurling her to one side and dashing out the light. Her back was toward him, for he came from Gerald's own premises known as the Den. In that den directly opposite was one of her revolvers loaded. She found it, even in the darkness, and hurrying forth again, intending to chase the intruder and alarm the sentry at the rear, encountered either the same or a second man close to the back door, a man who sprang past her like a panther and darted down the steps at the back of the house, followed by 2 shots from her Smith & Wesson. One of these men wore a soldier's overcoat, for the cape, ripped from the collar seam, was left in her hands. Another soldier's overcoat was later found at the rear fence, but no boots, shoes, or tracks thereof, yet both these men, judging from the sound, had been in stocking feet, or possibly rubbers, or perhaps, but that last suspicion she kept to herself, for Mrs. Hay too was now among the arrivals in the house, full of sympathy and genuine distress. The alarm then had gone beyond the guard-house, and the creators thereof beyond the ken of the guard, for not a sentry had seen or heard anything suspicious until after the shots. Then Number 8, Flint's latest addition, declared that from his post at Hayes Corral he had distinctly heard the swift hoof-beats of a brace of ponies darting up the level bench to the westward. Number 5 had turned up safely and declared that at the moment the scream was heard he was round by the flagstaff, listening to the night chorus of a pack of yelping coyotes afar out to the northwest, and then he thought he heard scrambling and running down at the foot of the bluff just as the shots were fired. Investigation on his part was what took him out of sight for the moment, and later investigation showed that one marauder, at least, had gone that way, for a capeless greatcoat was found close down by the shore, where some fugitive had tossed it in his flight. This overcoat bore, half erased from the soiled lining, the name of Culligan, Troop K, but Culligan had served out his time and taken his discharge a year before. The other overcoat was even older, an infantry coat, with shorter cape, bearing a company number 47 but no name. Both garments savoured strongly of the stable. Then, before quiet was restored, certain search was made about the quarters. It was found the intruders had obtained admission through the basement door at the back, which was never locked, for the sentry on number 5 had orders to call Bitzer at 5:30 a.m. to start the fires, milk the cow, etc. Hogan, Ray's factotum, being roused about the same time. The marauders had gone up the narrow stairway into the kitchen, first lashing one end of a leather halter strap about the knob of Bitzer's door and the other to the base of the big refrigerator, a needless precaution, as it took sustained and determined effort, as many a sentry on number 5 could testify, to rouse Bitzer from even a nap. It was no trick for the prowlers to softly raise the trapdoor leading to the kitchen, and once there the rest of the house was practically open. Such a thing as burglary or sneak thieving about the officers' quarters had been unheard of at Frayne for many a year. One precaution the visitors had taken, that of unbolting the back door so that retreat might not be barred in case they were discovered. Then they had gone swiftly and noiselessly about their work. But what had they taken? The silver was upstairs, intact, under Mrs. Blake's bed. So was the little safe in which was kept her jewellery and their valuable papers. Books, bric-a-brac, everything downstairs seemed unmolested. No item was missing from its accustomed place. Mrs. Blake thought perhaps the intruders had not entered her room at all. In Gerald's den were stacks, as he said, of relics, souvenirs, trophies of chase and war, but no one thing of the intrinsic value of $50. What could have been the object of their midnight search, was the question all Fort Frayne was asking as people dispersed and went home, the doctor intimating it was high time that Mrs. Blake was permitted to seek repose. Not until he had practically cleared the house of all but her most intimate friends, Mrs. Dade and Mrs. Ray, would Waller permit himself to ask a question that had been uppermost in his mind ever since he heard her story. "Mrs. Blake, someone has been ransacking Mr. Field's quarters for letters or papers. Now, was there anything of that kind left by the captain that someone may have needed?" Nanny Blake's head was uplifted instantly from Marian's shoulders. She had been beginning to feel the reaction. For one moment the three women looked intently into each other's faces. Then up they started and trooped away into Gerald's den. The doctor followed. The upper drawer of a big flat-topped desk stood wide open, and pretty Mrs. Blake opened her eyes and mouth in emulation as she briefly exclaimed, "It's gone!" Then Waller went forthwith to the quarters of the commander and caught him still in conference with his quartermaster and the guard, 4 or 5 of the latter being grouped without. The major retired to his front room, where with Wilkins he received the doctor. "Major Flint," said Waller, "those overcoats belong to Mr. Hayes' stablemen, Pete and Crapaud. Will you order their immediate arrest?" "I would, doctor," was the answer, "but they are not at the corral. We know how to account for the hoofbeats in the valley. Those scoundrels have got nearly an hour's start, and we've nobody to send in chase." Then it presently appeared that the post commander desired to continue conference with his staff officer, for he failed to invite the post surgeon to be seated. Indeed, he looked up into the doctor's kindling eyes with odd mixture of impatience and embarrassment in his own, and the veteran practitioner felt the slight, flushed instantly, and with much hauteur of manner took prompt but ceremonious leave. And when morning came and Fort Frayne awoke to another busy day, as if the excitements of the night gone by had not been enough for it, a new story went buzzing, with the first call for guard mount, about the garrison, and bigger even than yesterday the 2 details, in soldier silence, began to gather in front of the infantry quarters. Major Flint had ordered sentries posted at the trader's home, with directions that Mrs. Hay was not to be allowed outside her gate, and no one, man or woman, permitted to approach her from without, except by express permission of the post commander. General Harney and Dan, the 2 best horses of the trader's stable, despite the presence of the sentry at the front, had been abstracted some time during the earlier hours of the night, and later traced to the ford at Stabber's old camp, and with Pete and Crapaud doubtless were gone. That day the major wired to Omaha that he should be reinforced at once. 1/2 his little force, he said, was now mounted each day for guard, and the men couldn't stand it. The general, of course, was in the field, but his chief of staff remained at headquarters and was empowered to order troops from post to post within the limits of the department. Flint hoped 2 more companies would come at once, and he did not care what post was denuded in his favor. His, he said, was close to the Indian lands, separated from them in fact only by a narrow and fordable river. The Indians were all on the warpath, and aware of his puny numbers, might be tempted at any moment to quit the mountains and concentrate on him. Moreover, he was satisfied there had been frequent communication between their leaders and the household of the post trader at Fort Frayne. He was sure Mrs. Hay had been giving them valuable information, and he expected soon to be able to prove very serious charges against her. Meantime, he had placed her under surveillance. That she had been ever since his coming, although she never realized it. Fancy the sensation created at Omaha, where the Hays were well known, when this news was received. Flint did not say under arrest, guarded day and night by a brace of sentries who were sorely disgusted with their duty. He had no doubt his appeals for more troops would be honored, in view of his strenuous representations. But the day passed without assurance to that effect, and without a wired word to say his action regarding Mrs. Hay had been approved. It began to worry him. At 3 p.m. Mrs. Hay sent and begged him to call upon her, that she might assure and convince him of her innocence. But this the Major found means to refuse, promising, however, a meeting in the near future, after he had received tidings from the front, which he was awaiting and expecting every moment. He had reluctantly given permission to visit her to Mrs. Dade, Mrs. Ray, and 2 or 3 other women, whose hearts were filled with sympathy and sorrow, and their heads with bewilderment over the amazing order. Indeed, it was due to Mrs. Dade's advice that she so far triumphed over pride and wrath as to ask to see the Major and explain. She had received tidings from her husband and Nanette. She was perfectly willing to admit it, to tell all about it, and now that Pete and Crapaud had turned out to be such unmitigated rascals, to have them caught and castigated, if caught they could be. But all this involved no disloyalty. They had always been friendly with the Sioux, and the Sioux with them. Everybody knew it, no one better than General Crook himself, and if he approved, why should a junior disapprove? Indeed, as she asked her friends, what junior who had ever known Mr. Hay and her, or the Indians either, would be apt to disapprove so long as the Indians, when on the warpath, received no aid or comfort from either her husband or herself? And if they had, said she, further waxing eloquent over her theme, could we have begun to give them half the aid or comfort, or 1,000th part of the supplies and ammunition they got day after day through the paid agents of the Interior Department? But these were questions army people could not properly discuss, their mission in life being rather to submit to than suggest criticism. And so another restless day went by, and no more news came from either front or rear, from the range to the north or Rock Springs at the south, and Flint was just formulating another fervid appeal to that impassive functionary, the Adjutant General at Omaha, when toward evening word came whistling down the line in the person of Master Sanford Ray that 2 couriers were in sight scooting in from Moccasin Ridge, and Flint and fully half the soldier strength of Fort Frayne gathered on the northward bluff, like the wan burghers of ancient Rome, to watch and speed their coming. Who could tell what the day might yet bring forth? It was well nigh dark before the foremost reached the ford, a scout in worn and tawdry buckskin, wearied and impassive. He gave his dispatch to the care of the first officer to accost him, and took the way to the store, briefly saying in reply to questions that he was too dry to speak the truth. So they flocked at respectful distance about the Major as he read the hurried lines. The general bade the post commander wire the entire message to Washington, and to take all precautions for the protection of the few settlers about him. The columns under Colonel Henry and Major Webb had united near the headwaters of the Clear Fork of the Powder, had had a rattling running fight with Lame Wolf's people, had driven them into the mountains, and were following hot on the trail, but that Stabber's band and certain disaffected Sioux had cut loose from the main body and gone south. Whistling Elk, a young chief of much ambition, had quarreled with certain of the Red Cloud element, and joined Stabber with his entire band. Look out for them, and watch for signals any day or night from Eagle Butte. Flint read with sinking heart. Indian fighting was something far too scientific for his martial education, and too much for his skeleton command. In the gathering dusk his face looked white and drawn, and old Wilkins, breasting his way up the slope, puffed hard as he begged for news. There was still another dispatch, however, which was evidently adding to the Major's perturbation, for it concerned him personally, and for the moment Wilkins went unheard. The General desires that you send the couriers back within 24 hours of their arrival, after you have had time to scout the line of the Platte, say 20 miles each way, giving full report of every Indian seen or heard of. He enjoins vigilance and hopes to keep the Sioux so busy that they can send no more in your direction. Should they do so, however, he will pursue at once. He trusts that you are doing everything possible to comfort and reassure Mrs. Hay, and that you can send good news of Lieutenant Field. And this when he had just refused to remove the sentries or to visit Mrs. Hay, this when he had just been told by Dr. Waller that Lieutenant Field was distinctly worse. He is simply fretting his heart out here," were the doctor's words to him but a short time before, "and while unable to mount a horse, he is quite strong enough now to take the trip by ambulance, slowly, that is, to Rock Springs. I fear his father is failing. I fear Field will fail if not allowed to go. I recommend a 7 days' leave, with permission to apply to Omaha for 30. He'll probably need it." "I can't permit government teams and ambulances to be used for any such purpose," said the major stoutly. "It is distinctly against orders." "Then, sir, he can go in my spring wagon, and we'll hire mules for Mrs. Hay," was the doctor's prompt reply. "He can do no good here, Major. He may do much good there." But Flint was full of information and official zeal. The matter of Field's going had been broached before, and when told of it, the Wilkins pair had been prompt with their protests. "Of course he'd be wantin' to get away," said Wilkins, "wid all that money to account for, let alone these other things." The Irishman was hot against the young West Pointer who had derided him. He doubtless believed his own words. He never dreamed how sorely the lad now longed to see his father, how deep was his anxiety on that father's account, how filled with apprehension on his own, for that rifled desk had brought him reason for most painful thought. Wilkins and Field had been antagonistic from the start. Neither could see good in the other, and egged on by his worthy spouse's exhortations, the quartermaster had seized the opportunity to fill the post commander's too receptive mind with all his own suspicions, and this at a crucial time. "I can't listen to it, Dr. Waller," said the major sternly. "Here's a matter of near $1,000 that young man has got to answer for the moment he is well enough to stir, and if he can't account for it, you well know what my duty will demand." End of chapter 18.